right, stand by, Mark. Okay, stand by. 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good afternoon. Today is December 21st. It's a Monday. It's 2009. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And today it's my honor to interview Howard Peters. We're going to be talking to Howard about his experiences in the Department of Corrections and as Secretary of Human Services. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is part two. I'm sure that people who were watching part one of your interview got fascinated with your life and the story that you had to tell, just as I did. So they're hopefully looking forward to this second session as well. And I wanted to start, I thought this would be a good place to start and to interject the role that religion played in your life, because I know that you are an ordained minister. So before we get back into the Department of Correction career, if you could tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Well, I grew up in church. As I mentioned in other discussions, my grandmother and my mother are both very committed to their faith and to God, and so I spent time in church as a child. I was always hearing from them about God and their God and what God would do, and so ultimately you have to believe for yourself, and I did become a believer. And in 1999, I preached my first sermon. Preaching was something that was never something that I wanted to do, but it was something that I believe the Spirit of God had spoken to me about for a number of years, and I finally simply surrendered and preached my first sermon in 1999, and preach every chance I get. I'm an associate pastor at the Union Baptist Church in Springfield. Teach Sunday school every Sunday morning, and as I say, preach every chance I get.
Well, that story then, at least the preaching portion of it, comes well onto what we're going to be discussing about today. Do you recall the moment when you were baptized?
I do indeed. I was actually baptized in Memphis, Tennessee, in a swimming pool. And I remember being a little bit disappointed because up until that point, people were actually baptized in a pond. And that always seemed more religious and spiritual and special to me. So when finally I was a believer and confessed Christ and was going to be baptized, my assumption was we was going to go to the pond, and when you're at the pond and the mothers are singing, it's a very, very spiritual situation. Instead, I was baptized at the local swimming pool, probably a lot more sanitary and a lot more safe. But yes, I remember quite vividly.
Was this the shallow end of the pool?
It was. It was.
How old were you at the time?
I was in my early teens. I don't recall precisely how old, but it would have been in my early teens.
And I assume throughout your career you stayed active in church activities as well?
Yes, particularly after I moved to Springfield. Early on in my career, we moved a lot, so we were affiliated with various churches as we moved. When we came to Springfield in 91, a pastor of a local church actually came to my office. I had recently been appointed Director of Corrections, came to my office and claimed me as a member of his church, Reverend Rudolph Schultz, who was then the pastor of the Union Baptist Church. And as he requested, I did start attending there and ultimately joined there. And he was a great mentor for me, and eventually he was the pastor that ordained me.
Just like so many other people in the Bible then, it wasn't you choosing them, they chose you, huh?
That's exactly right. That's actually scriptural. Jesus taught that we didn't choose him, he chose us. And God decided to call us out and call us unto himself.
Okay, very good. I think last time when we left off, we had you in East St. Louis, and I wanted to start with your move to Chicago. Would East St. Louis be right, or were you?
I did spend a period of, I guess, about 5 years from 71, from 73 to about December of 77, I believe. And then I went to Chicago to be responsible for juvenile field services in the Chicago, Cook County area. So we had some community-based correctional programs, parole services that we ran, some vocational and school alternative school programs that we ran for kids there in Chicago, Cook County.
That's a huge area. I mean, Cook County, you're talking about 5 million people at the time?
It is a huge area, and it was a growth spurt for me in terms of being able to manage, bigger, more complex things. I have really had the good fortune to see my career progress through a series of steps where progressively larger opportunities came. Because actually, after a year managing juvenile corrections programs in Cook County, I then was asked by Governor Thompson to become the regional director for Children and Family Services in Cook County. And that was another, eye-opening experience. The whole idea of protecting children from their parents, from abuse and neglect is a daunting and difficult undertaking. I have an abiding respect for the people who do this work.
When you were doing that, did you step away from the corrections work, or was this an additional duty?
No, I actually left the Department of Corrections and went to the Department of Children and Family Services and took on the responsibilities as regional director in Cook County for that period of time.
Now, this is one of those jobs where you're rarely a hero. There's lots of problems and issues that come up. Are there any instances that stand out in your memory during the time you were doing that?
It was a good experience and a learning experience, but as I say, a very, very difficult experience. We completely reorganized Cook County Children and Family Services during that period of time that I was there, and got a better handle on making sure that children who were abused or neglected didn't suffer second and third incidences of abuse, which sometimes can be fatal, before we intervened. So it was a good experience. It was a very difficult, as I say, experience. I stayed there for a little over a year, and then actually went back to corrections as the superintendent of the largest juvenile institution at St. Charles, the Illinois Youth Center at St. Charles, which you will recall, I actually started in a lower level position in Illinois Corrections at St. Charles.
Was that a refreshing move back, or did you regret it, or a little bit of both, making that move?
The Children and Family Service experience had been a real learning experience, a real growth experience. But I did feel that I was more suited, more prepared for a career in corrections than at that time a career in child protective services. So I think that we added some things, we improved some things, and then it was time to move on. So I was glad to be back in more familiar territory, if you will. But St. Charles was a huge challenge as well. At the time that I became superintendent there, the community was in uproar. They were having record numbers of escapes, runaways, and kids were running away, stealing the neighbors' cars, breaking into neighbors' homes. So it was a crucial moment, and people were calling for the institution to be closed. So it was a crucial moment in the history of corrections as far as that institution was concerned. And so I got a call from the director of corrections actually asking if I knew someone I'd recommend for the job. And on the third time he called me looking for recommendations, I then said to him, I think I'd be interested in doing that. And so then I returned to corrections and became superintendent there and was superintendent there, I think, for the next 4 years.
It sounds like that move was something of you being the fire brigade riding to the rescue. Would that be about right?
In a lot of ways, a number of positions that I've had in my career were kind of fire brigade experiences. When I was asked to go to Children and Family Services, it was a fire brigade experience. And so then coming to St. Charles, and there were some others, stops along the way in adult corrections that fit that same pattern.
When you went from Child and Family Service back to Department of Corrections, did that require picking up the phone and talking to Governor Thompson?
Well, actually, the director of corrections, a guy named Gail Franson, had worked that out with the governor once I said that I was interested in the position. The question then was what to do about, Cook County region of Children and Family Services. And that got worked through, and I was off to St. Charles.
Now that you're back in Youth Center, this is basically where you started your career as well, and you're in corrections.
Yes.
In the true meaning of the word corrections. I want you to reflect on that a little bit, working at a place like St. Charles. What does that mean? How did you approach really trying to solve these young men's problems? And I assume it was young men you were working with.
That's correct. I had the good fortune of a man whose name is Samuel Sublett Jr., who actually adopted me as a mentee. He really became my mentor. He was involved in something called the accreditation process for the American Corrections Association. And early on in my tenure back at St. Charles, he gave me the standards, the book of standards, and said, here is something that you can take a look at, with no real expectation that St. Charles was an institution that in the near term could be accredited. Actually, no juvenile institution in the country at that time had been accredited. And so I looked at the standards for a period of time and then declared out loud and to the staff at St. Charles that we're going to become the first juvenile institution in the country to be accredited by the American Corrections Association. One of the great utterances of my career, because what it required us to do was really examine every operation, every policy, every procedure in that institution, and not just did we have a policy or procedure, but to measure the practice continuously against the policy and procedure. It allowed us to go from an institution that the people in the community wanted closed to being, especially for a large juvenile institution, somewhat of a model institution. We didn't become the first institution accredited in the country. We were the second juvenile institution accredited in the country. A small juvenile institution out east beat us by a few months. But it was, again, a great experience in terms of my own growth and development as a leader of people, as someone who could inspire people to do what was viewed as unattainable. Because St. Charles was an old, large institution, and no one contemplated at that time that big old large institutions could meet the standards. And so when you first utter that as a goal, the reaction is he serious? Well, it turned out that I was serious, and we got it done.
Take you a while to convince the staff, though, that this was worth doing?
Absolutely. But not just that it was worth doing, that it was possible to do, because it was old, it was crowded, it had a poor reputation at the time, and it was in a head down, stay below the radar, just try to survive kind of mode. And here is this notion that we're going to lead, that we're going to be a head up, proud operation, that we're going to lead the rest of juvenile corrections into this accreditation movement. And that's actually what happened. But it did take a lot of work to help it catch on, with the leadership of the institution and then the rank and file. You can't be, and certainly couldn't at that time, an accredited institution without really broad-based commitment and investment on the part of the staff. And so they had to learn that I was committed enough and strong enough to take them there.
Was part of the accreditation process that you had to meet certain goals for actually proving that young men's lives had been turned around?
There were standards that deal with everything from treatment and rehabilitation and education and vocational programs and security, right down the line. Every aspect. There were, as I recall, about 450 or 480 different standards that you had to meet. And by the way, it required a team of people, when you were ready to be evaluated, a team of people from outside of the state of Illinois to come in and evaluate your facility against these 480 or so objective standards. So it wasn't, do we like these people? Do we think they're trying? But are they actually meeting national standards? And you had to meet each of a high percentage of those standards. And we came out in the upper 90% of meeting all of the standards that were established for a juvenile corrections institution. So, and it was a multi-year work. This was not something that we said we were going to do, and in a couple of months it was achieved.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall any of those things specifically that really worked well in terms of effectively changing a young man's life for the better, and maybe something that didn't turn out the way that you had envisioned?
Oh, there are many instances of where kids' lives were changed and turned around, and it has as much to do with as anything the investment that young people, young men, see you as making in them. Can you get the staff really invested in a meaningful and a real way of helping this young person believe that there is the prospect of a future in which they do constructive things, in which they prosper. And yes, we have seen it where you take an adolescent who is literally illiterate, cannot read, and teach that child, to read, at a fifth, sixth, seventh grade level, and a brave new world opens up for them. You teach them some self-discipline, the thing that young people, and it's a serious problem in our country today, that young people, need, is to recognize that there are forces in the world stronger than the will of a 15-year-old, and that they can begin to have some discipline about themselves and some restraint. And I think of many times in the course of my career where you see young men, young people begin to get a glimpse, a grasp of that they can learn, that they can transcend the environments where they came from, and that they can be disciplined, that they can do worthwhile things. If they're illiterate, you've got to teach them to read. If they're addicted to drugs, you've got to get them treatment and get them unaddicted. If you've got to teach them the discipline of work and those kind of things. And so there are many instances. I remember one young man in particular, and this young man really comes out of my first experience at at St. Charles, who was just he was just a mess. I wish I could tell you his name and I could give a shout out to him. We actually shared the same birthday. And there was not much hope for a turnaround in his life. But we got invested in him, got staff invested in him. And years later, when I was now warden of the Centralia Correctional Center on a Sunday morning. A very handsome young man knocks on my door of my residence. And I opened the door, and this young man rushed to give me a hug and told me who he was. And we sat and talked for hours about the changes that had occurred in his life. And the thing that you have to remember, that people have to remember, is when you invest in young people, you don't get an immediate return on that investment. They don't all say, I wish someone had told me this years ago. Oh, what a wonderful person you are. So you have to give them, each one, your best effort, the best, programs and services that you can. And then you see what happens. You hope for the best. You know that if you don't, they'll continue in despair. But when you do, there's a return on that investment. Oftentimes, like in this case, years later, I had no idea, really, that I was reaching, and that we were, and it wasn't just me, it was the team of people I was working with, was reaching this young fella. But his recollection of it, when we were sitting on my porch that day, was how invested we were. And the things that we said to him, and the things that he remembered from that experience. But he wasn't saying at the time, oh, I'm going to remember this forever. This is really going to be useful to me.
Yeah, I'm sure he wasn't.
Yeah, so there are those instances where you get feedback years later of the impact, and you see a young man with a family and with a career and doing well. There are also disappointments.
I was going to say, how hard was it for you to, having the kind of background that you did, your own personal story, to see these young men coming there and had really no kind of family foundation? Was that a difficult thing to deal with for you?
It is difficult for, not just for me, but all of the people who encounter young people in this kind of condition, a sense of, where do I start? And the thing that I have found is that leaders have to work to keep the staff's spirits up, to keep their sense of optimism, to help them, to remind them that this really is good work. This is work that's going to have a return. You won't see it during the period of time that you are invested in this young man or this young woman's life, but failure to make the investment, is to condemn this young person. And to make the investment, has promise of hope. We never know how young people are going to turn out. People were pretty pessimistic at points in my life about how I was going to turn out, and perhaps with good cause. But if some of the adults get invested, it's going to matter.
Now, when we had met earlier, you suggested that I should ask you about, where is my mother? Is that a story that comes to mind?
Oh, yes. That was during the period of time that I was at Children and Family Services. And I said it's very difficult to protect children who are neglected and abused. And doing some of the effort to make sure that children are not abused or neglected a second or a third time, there's a tendency to grab up children and put them in foster care or in substitute care or in group homes, and believing that's the way to protect them. And I had an experience that helped me understand that you've got to be more careful and more thoughtful and diverse in your effort. And it was two young girls who were now teenagers and had spent most of their lives in substitute care, from one foster home or group home to the next. And these two young girls came into the office this particular day just screaming, "Where is my mother? Where is my mother?" and feeling that they had been robbed of their roots, had been robbed. And we can make some pretty harsh judgments sometimes about the usefulness of parents. You know, they have addictions, they have problems, and we decide to write them off. But we have to remember that their offsprings will come looking for them. Their offsprings want to be grounded in their parents, and whether we realize it or not, they are. And so we really do have to be willing to make the investment in trying to, as much as possible, sustain children in the context of their families and work with difficult families, and not just grab children and put them in substitute care. We have to think about how we can reunite children with their parents. Otherwise, they will wake up one day with an empty space inside of them that they will want filled. And it was just a harsh learning experience in that day with those young girls. To remember that when you're working with young people, that the judgments that you can make about hopelessness of their situation or their parents and write them off and think that you can put them in a better place or better situation. You have to be careful and to remember that children want connections with their roots.
We've been talking about other families and your role in helping young men and your role of helping children who are finding themselves in a very chaotic situation. But this is during the time frame you're building your own family, I believe. And seems to me you're moving every couple of years, and you know, wives have opinions about that sometimes. How did Beverly deal with all these moves you're making?
I had the good fortune of being married to a woman who was highly supportive of my career aspirations. Now remember that this is a woman who has known me since second grade. We were in second grade together, graduated from high school together. So this is someone who knows me. And she was a teacher as we graduated from college the same year. And as much as I did not find teaching to my liking, she loved teaching. So she was a good teacher. I can remember kids who were in her room in the second grade the first year we were married. So as I moved in my career, she taught in public school. And so she would every couple of years find herself having to find a new teaching job. Because she was trained as a special education teacher, she was able to get a new job each year. But it was to her disadvantage, because as she would develop a reputation as a master teacher, then she would move. And sometimes at the time that I was being offered a promotion or a new job, she was as well. And she conceded to go where I needed to go in pursuit of this career. I had decided early on I wanted to be director of corrections, and I was willing to pursue the kind of experiences that it would require to become director of corrections. She took off a few years to have our sons in the middle 70s. We have a son that was born in 75 and one that was born in 76. And when she decided to go back to work in about 78 or 79, by then she decided, and I think wisely, that she would just teach in the Department of Corrections, so that when then they wanted to move me, they'd have to move her as well. So while I was superintendent at St. Charles, she was actually teaching at the Correctional Institution for Juvenile Girls at Warrenville. And it did turn out that, so as I moved to various prisons, the department would move her to teaching at a neighboring prison. It wasn't desirable for us to work at the same institution, especially if I was the superintendent or warden of that institution. So she would get a position at a neighboring institution, which sometimes would be 40, 50 miles away. So to her disadvantage, but she endured it, only to tell people the story now that the minute I became director of corrections, the first thing I did was fire her. But that's not exactly the way it went. But she did leave corrections after I became director of corrections.
You mentioned last time we finished off with your aspirations to eventually become the director of Department of Corrections, and you just mentioned it again. So this is probably a good time to bring it up and to elaborate on that a little bit. I'm thinking that as a fairly young man, new to corrections, the thing not to say to all your colleagues is, I think I want to be the director someday. That's what I'm going to do. That might alienate people in the process. And also I'm thinking that many people would approach that and say, if that's what I want to do, then I need to get more involved in politics, because that's how you get to those kind of positions. What were you thinking at the time, and how did you approach that?
Well, I'll first tell you that it didn't as much alienate people as it humored them.
So you let people know you weren't shy about that.
I was very open and verbal about the fact that I intended to be director of corrections. So much so that when I actually became director of corrections, people would come up to me and tell me this story. They would say, "Do you remember, in '82, we were at this place and you said you were going to be director of corrections, and we all started laughing and you didn't laugh." and I didn't remember every one of those situations, but I certainly remembered some of them, and it was just it is just an indication that yes, I was very open about the fact that I intended to be director of corrections. And keep in mind that, why would people laugh? Well, at the time I was saying I was going to be director of corrections, there were maybe one or two people in the country who were African Americans who had been directors of corrections, and there hadn't been one in Illinois, and people would think, and even when there is, why you? But I was serious about it, and I tell this to young adults and young people starting out in the profession all the time. It matters if you set career goals, because you move toward what you think about. And so I set out I decided, for example, they're not going to make me director of corrections unless I can show that I can do difficult things. So I sought out difficult jobs. You said earlier, used the term fire brigade. Well, I made myself available to go into situations that were troubled, with full knowledge that, if I couldn't make a contribution and I didn't prevail, that I was going to get fired, because I served at the pleasure. I didn't have civil service protection and that kind of thing, so I served at the pleasure of the director and the governor. So I made myself available for difficult assignments, because I came to believe early that it's in those assignments wherein lies both the proving ground and the learning experiences, the things that I needed to learn. Now, I wasn't always realistic about the things that I needed to learn, but I had the good fortune of being put in some situations where I learned some things that I didn't even know I needed to learn. So I began to pursue opportunities. The other thing that I was very conscious of was developing a reputation of getting things done and being helpful. So I wanted to be the guy that if you had a difficult situation, that you would call up and ask for help, and I'd make myself available for help. I mentioned at the end of our last conversation that I developed a personal motto for myself, that I'll be ready even if I don't get to go. Because I had no control over some things, whether I would actually get picked, whether the politics would be right, whether the equal opportunity would be there, whether, race would stand in the way. I had no control over that, and really decided not to bog myself down into that, but to look at and work on my own preparation, and a belief that God would see to everything else. So no, I didn't get involved in the politics. That wasn't something that really even occurred to me. What occurred to me, and I know the old saying about it's not what you know, it's who you know. I was more focused on the what you know part of it, and developing the kind of reputation that I used to say, I'm going to be the heir apparent. And what I meant by heir apparent was that if someone said, if there is going to be a new warden of a maximum security prison, who do you think it would be? And people would have to call my name. If someone would say, if there's going to be a new deputy director, who do you think it would be? And they'd have to call my name. And ultimately, if a new governor is going to pick a director of corrections who can really get this done, who do you think? And they'd have to call my name. That's what I was grounded in and focused on. And so I never got involved in the political side of it. That wasn't something I knew. I didn't know political people. I remember when Governor Thompson asked me to go to be director of regional director of Children and Family Services. He asked me about then the party chairman in the county I lived in, who was a very well-known political figure. I had no idea who he was. So I didn't get involved in the political end of it. I had the good fortune of doing the work and ultimately getting recognized by political people, Jim Edgar, as someone that could be useful to him, that could be helpful to him.
Now, I'm taking you back now to your high school days. Had you at least given up on the aspiration of becoming the smartest man in the world?
Let's just say I didn't stop wanting to be. I just didn't diligently pursue that aspiration as I pursued being director of corrections.
And we talked, you mentioned Governor Thompson. And during the time you're at St. Charles, there's a couple new initiatives that he's pursuing on the political agenda, if you will, that impact the Department of Corrections, especially down the road. And I'm thinking of it's a Class X felony.
Indeterminate sentencing. Governor Thompson did come in with a kind of get tough on crime movement and did institute or legislate Class X offenses and determinate sentencing. And that was a movement that was going on not just in Illinois, but across the country. And it did have a major impact on the growth of corrections, especially on the adult side in terms of the prison population. At the time I became director of corrections, for example, Illinois had built 15 prisons in the previous 15 years. In other words, a prison a year. Illinois in 1991, when I became director of corrections, had a 21% growth, which made it the fastest growing prison population in the country. So those measures did have an awful lot of impact on the growth of the size and the cost of the prison operation. And I'll talk, or certainly would like to at some point talk a little bit about the Edgar years and some of the things that we began to do to try to get a handle on the kind of spending and the kind of growth in that population.
Yeah, we will certainly be doing that. I wonder if you can express your personal views about Class X and whether that was the right direction to take on this issue.
I don't know that I can say it was the right or wrong direction to take. Certainly, in those years, there was a growing concern in communities about crime, and that needed something, needed to be done to get a handle on people who were really making communities and the streets unsafe for the people who lived there and who were trying to be law-abiding. But like any public policy, it needs to be revisited from time to time. There are unintended consequences. And so we found ourselves with a lot of people who needed to be in prison, and some people needed to be in prison forever. I've met guys in prison that you have a conversation with them and walk away from them and want to say, man, I'm glad you locked up. But at the same time, there are many people that alternatives to incarceration could work, or shorter prison sentences could work. And so it's a matter of striking the right balance. And so some of those measures needed to be revisited during the 90s, and to some extent need to be revisited now.
Another one that was in discussion during those early years of the Thompson administration was the death penalty. Another one that has a direct impact on what's going on in the Department of Corrections. Your thought on that?
Well, you may not be aware, but that I was Director of Corrections and oversaw the first execution in over 30 some years, when we executed John Wayne Gacy during my tenure at the Department of Corrections, and did several other executions during my tenure. So I'm not opposed to the ultimate penalty. I'm not opposed to the death penalty. As a matter of fact, to get ahead of the story, I was very disturbed and disappointed in Governor Ryan's actions. You see, there are people who may have been on death row whose sentences needed to be looked at, and a lesser penalty, life imprisonment, may have been appropriate for it. But to do it on just a blanket scale, as opposed to a case-by-case review, I found very distressing. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that in our country and in our state, the people who face the death penalty are mostly poor and colored. They are Latino, Hispanic, they're African American, and they're poor. And so there is a class issue and a race issue that's affected and involved in this whole capital punishment question. But yet there are offenses that I do believe that capital punishment is appropriate for. That's unfortunate, but there are people who demonstrate that they cannot live in a community and the rest of us be safe. They kill, and they kill more than once. And some of those folks demonstrate that they can't live in a prison environment and the rest of the folks are safe. They kill in prison. So there's a role. It's a small slice, but there is a role for capital punishment. I think that we can do a much better job of making sure that people who do get sentenced to capital punishment have the right kind of trial, the right kind of review, the right kind of appeal process to make sure that they really are guilty, and this really is the right penalty. So we can do a better job with how we process capital crimes and capital punishment in our country. The other part of the reality for me is that if capital punishment is going to matter and is going to work, the idea of a person committing a crime and 15, 20 years later they're executed, is offensive to the sensibility. That's no deterrent and no real punishment, because the victims of that crime, have suffered continuously for that 15-year period. So we've got to do a better job. We can be more efficient, but I'm not a person who is opposed to capital punishment. I do think it needs to be very narrow in terms of how it's applied, when it's applied. And I do think we need to look at the class issue and the race issue.
Okay. I think it's very important for us to kind of get some markers as we talk about these more philosophical issues. You've done a wonderful job. Now we're going to go into some more moves that you've had, and I believe the next move is to Centralia. Does that sound right?
Yes.
1984, February 1984?
That's right. February 1st of 84, the Director of Corrections asked me to go to Centralia, Illinois, a place that I had no interest in going.
Why?
I'm a urban center focused person. At least that's how I saw myself at the time. You know, I wanted to be near and in an urban center. That's where the music I wanted to hear and the food I wanted to eat and the lifestyle I wanted to live was. And the director did me a favor and sent me instead to Centralia, Illinois. What I didn't know I needed was a real sense of legitimacy among non-African Americans. To be in an environment where you are the leader and really a minority. There were very few African Americans in Centralia and who worked at that prison. And so my going there, although there were problems to solve, which was part of the reason for my going there, but my going there was very distressing, to the staff there. And years later, I had conversations with people who worked very effectively with me there, who talked about crying when they heard I was coming and when they met me, because of assumptions that they made about the kind of person, the kind of leader, the kind of priorities I would have. And I was very unaware of the need to demonstrate to people my leadership rather than having it assumed. So it was that I spent 2 years and a month in Centralia, and there was a very rigorous auditing process, performance auditing process of institutions that the then Director of Corrections had put into effect. And it was a very demanding process, even more so than the accreditation process. And in going to Centralia and looking at Centralia, I decided Centralia would be the first institution that had no negative findings. Well, no institution had ever had no negative findings. And, you know, here I come, this outsider, saying, we're going to be an institution with no negative findings, which was viewed as impractical. Well, we were the first institution that had no negative findings. And it wasn't just because I said it, and it wasn't just because of me, but it was getting the staff to rally around a goal that was important to the operation of the institution, the safety of the staff, the safety of the inmates, the effectiveness of programs, and void of a focus on personality, mine or theirs. Mm-hmm. And again, it was a learning experience in terms of leading people.
Well, you've mentioned this a couple times. A couple of different institutions, you set very ambitious goals, and I suspect that in those institutions, that you've already alluded to this, when you first stated those goals, there was some pushback and some reluctance to accept that. I wonder if you could then explain your management, how you saw yourself as a manager in your management process.
Somewhere along the line, I became aware of the notion that real leadership is taking people to places that they would not go on their own or by themselves. And so after my experience at St. Charles and the accreditation process, I started to look for, those imperatives. What's the imperative? What is it that we want to try to help people rise to another level, to do what they wouldn't do without us? I would say to the leadership team, and after Centralia, everywhere I went, when we weren't performing well, I would say to our team, they could do this without us. They don't have to pay us to get this result. They could do this without us. What's our added value? And so part of the style, if you will, as it began to emerge, it wasn't like I read a book or, had an epiphany. It evolved out of my experiences of looking for, what's my reason for being at this place now?
You mentioned already that one of the challenges you had is you're a black man in a white world. At least Centralia was certainly that way.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you had to also overcome some hurdles as far as age. How old were you when you got there?
I don't recall age really being at issue, but for example, what I learned later, coming from the juvenile division to the adult division was an issue. It didn't occur to me that it should be an issue, but as I learned later, they thought of me as a juvie, that I would come thinking that what inmates needed was a hug, and that staff were, too demanding of them, too hard on them, and that I would be more on the inmate side than on the staff side. Because after all, I come out of this juvenile background. Most of these inmates are African American or brown. So they had those kind of stereotypes or biases. I don't remember age being one of them. They had the big fish to fry, and so they never got around to thinking about, he's too young.
I think we neglected to describe what Centralia was, what kind of a prison it was.
Centralia was a medium security prison for adult males, and because of the growth spurt in prison populations in Illinois, because of some of the policies that we talked about earlier, Centralia was a prison that was built for 750 inmates, as I recall, and had about 1,100 inmates at the time that I went there as warden.
And that wasn't an issue with anybody in the state, or the accreditation process that you've talked about before, that serious overcrowding had occurred?
Serious overcrowding wasn't an issue for not only the accreditation process, but the day-to-day operation to make sure that, the programs and services and security and safety still, excelled. The reality for me, having gone through the situation at St. Charles, was that a sense that we can do this. We don't have to let quality slip or security slip because we have more inmates. And fortunately, the people there bought into that notion that we can still excel, even though, we're now double selling in rooms that were designed for one person, and so for some period of time had people sleeping in the gymnasium and sleeping in other spaces that weren't designed for housing.
How much was your job, I guess the question I'm asking, you came from an environment where it was very much about helping these young men adjust and become productive back in normal society. Medium security, that's a little bit more towards the side of the spectrum that deals with, okay, we just need to protect society from these folks. but was there still a healthy amount of corrections, and how did you find that balance?
There was even in at the period of time that I went to Centralia, we had on an agreement with the local community college to come in and teach vocational programs, to teach college level courses. We had a full blown school program, so there was still yet in those days a commitment to the notion that we wanted to return these people to the community better than they were when they were first incarcerated. So there was still a commitment at that time for vocational treatment programs, academic programs.
Maybe we're getting too ahead of the story, but you said in those days, at that time, attitudes have changed towards that now?
Certainly did as the cost of corrections continued to increase, as people became more negative about offenders. They started raising questions about, why should inmates have academic and vocational programs? Why should they have, college programs? Why should they have recreation? So what I will label a meanness, did begin to evolve into the process to expect and be concerned less about the kind of treatment that offenders get, and more just keep them locked away, feed them, focus on security, and not some of these other kind of things. Fortunately, to some extent, maybe, that came more after the Edgar days and after my period of time in corrections. You can see a real decline in the number of academic and vocational programs and treatment programs that took place following that. Now,
So your statement on that is a perception that the public has, not necessarily the mission that the Department of Corrections has.
It's certainly not. It's certainly not shared by the corrections professionals. To this day, today there are some education and vocational programs. There are people who are still struggling, trying to give these incarcerated people experiences that are going to allow them to return to the community, more likely to be law-abiding than they were when they came in. So that effort continues. It continues with less support than was the case earlier. And I don't want to put this on the public exclusively. This is a political phenomenon as much as it's a public phenomenon. People who run for office tap into those negative vibes, if you will, and they campaign on, getting tough and eliminating, these programs for these inmates, and they target, or they have targeted at times gone by, inmates and prisons as places that should be more strict, and less concerned about treatment and that kind of thing.
What's next after Centralia?
I then went to Sheridan, a prison west of Joliet in LaSalle County. Again, a medium security prison that was housing far more inmates than their designed capacity at the time. Sheridan is a town of, they claimed about a population of about 700. So the prison population was bigger than the town. My children were the first African Americans to go to school in the town of Sheridan, because we actually lived in the little town of Sheridan, and my kids were in school there for a couple of years. So it was another opportunity to build on the Centralia experience.
Now, I know that Centralia now is a drug rehab program. Was that the case?
It's actually Sheridan. That's a drug rehab program.
And that's what I meant to say.
It was not at that time. It was a regular medium security prison. The drug rehab came much
Okay.
later. It's only about 3 or 4 years old.
Okay. And you were there for how long?
2 years and a month.
The kids are getting used to going to new schools, too.
That's right. When we left Sheridan, my children's request was, when we went to Sheridan, their request was, we've got to have a dog. When we left Centralia, when we left Sheridan, if I said when we went to Sheridan, it was we've got to have a dog. When I left Sheridan, it was we want to be in a town with a swimming pool and a movie theater. So their needs were those of sixth graders that were just basic. And as it turned out, Pontiac was where I went after Sheridan. They did have a swimming pool and a movie theater.
In the hierarchy of prisons in Illinois, you already alluded to the fact that, okay, he's working with youth. That's not quite like in the big leagues. Pontiac, how was that seen in the hierarchy thing among the folks in the Department of Corrections?
Pontiac's the big league. There were basically 3 maximum security prisons, Pontiac, Stateville, and Menard. To some extent, Joliet was considered a maximum security prison, but really it was the 3, Pontiac, Stateville, and Menard. Very, very difficult places to manage. The day I was asked to go to Pontiac, and by the way, I was looking for a maximum security experience, but
Why?
I did not believe an African American could become director of corrections who didn't show and demonstrate that they could do the toughest jobs. And the toughest jobs were in those 3 maximum security prisons. I believed you had to show you could successfully and effectively run a maximum security prison. But I wasn't willing to go to Pontiac at the time I was asked to go to Pontiac. A year earlier, a dear friend of mine had been killed there. A man whom I loved had been killed there, and I just didn't want to go to Pontiac. It wasn't that I wasn't still interested in maximum security. It was too soon in a real way for me to go there. The director of corrections convinced me it was the right place for me to go and that he needed me there. Because when I went to Sheridan, the agreement basically was things were okay at the maximum security prisons at the time. Go to Sheridan and kind of be the person in waiting, that when there is a fire to be put out in a maximum security prison, that's where you'd go. Well, as it turned out, the day I was asked to go, which was April Fool's Day of 86, 88, there was a fire to be put out. The inmates in the condemned unit had literally set on fire the condemned unit. And it was, a serious fire. And so as they were flying me into Pontiac, you could see the bellows of smoke, black smoke, coming up from the institution. And that's the scene and how I became warden at Pontiac. So I'm walking into this prison, and the fire trucks are going, and the ambulances are going, and smoke is towering up, and the media is there.
Microphones in your face?
Microphones in your face. What are you going to do to fix this?
And what's going through your mind?
I was really taken aback because, as I said, there was this landing strip right behind the prison, and we actually flew over, and you could see this humanity running in different directions, and the urgency of the situation. That didn't really get my attention, really, in terms of the reality of the situation. That really happened after the fire trucks are gone and after the media is gone, and I'm walking through this prison and seeing the situation, and if you're in that situation and something inside of you doesn't go, damn, you on drugs. So I was really struck in that moment by the magnitude of the challenge that, you've got to convince the staff and the inmates, for that matter, that this isn't the normality, that, the fire brigade isn't the normality, that this place can be managed orderly and people can be safe. And, the staff, can expect to come to work, do their 8 hours, and go home safely. So I was very struck later that day by the immenseness of this challenge, and you could see the despair on the faces of the staff and the inmates alike that this is bad.
What had gone wrong under the previous administration?
I don't know that I want to speak to that.
Okay. What did you decide you needed to do to fix the problem?
I knew that I needed to convince the staff that there was a way to exist without running from one crisis to the next, from one emergency to the next, from one injured employee or killed employee to the next, and that we could do that and still be humane. There was a lot of anger, and in some ways rightfully so, at Pontiac at the time. The person who was a dear friend of mine, was a superintendent there, had been killed. Just a couple of years earlier, an assistant warden had been killed by former inmates while he was visiting in Chicago. And those events caused a rekindling of the 1978 riots where people were killed. So there was a lot of anger among the staff there. And inmates felt a sense that, these people are out to get us. And these were, and some of these inmates were dangerous desperados. They were in maximum security for good reason. Some of the guys, most of the guys in the condemned unit were awful people in a very real way. So it was a matter of wanting to appeal to the staff from inside of them, to call upon them, their higher calling, to do good professional work and to be professionals, to require high standards, and to be humane at the same time. To be an accredited institution, even in the face of this kind of history.
What was the relationship with the community like when you got there?
Well, that's very interesting in the sense that this prison was very important to the community. The warden of this prison was the most watched person in America as far as they were concerned. And so they were highly invested in your methods, and they wanted to know what was going on. When there was an incident and the emergency alarm went off, it struck a chord, because they'd had situations where inmates escaped and did awful things to people in the community. So it was important to keep the community informed about our goals, our progress, what we were doing, how we were doing it. And so I was much more, in that sense, a local public figure, and became aware of that responsibility kind of more for the first time at Pontiac, because the community was so invested in what went on there, and rightly so. But mostly supportive, because the prison was the economic engine of the area. So they were mostly supportive. They wanted the prison. They wanted things to go well. They wanted it run well. But they were skeptical. Wardens, people, coming through to say, we're going to fix this, generally was short-lived and didn't last long.
So this is the kind, you're walking into a job where people kind of burn out after a year or two. Would that be fair to say?
It's fair to say that wardens didn't last long. There is a conference room where all of the former wardens' pictures are around the wall. And I used to ask them, when I leave, don't put my picture on this wall. And they put the tenure of the warden, from this date to that date, and there were, individuals after individuals who were there less than a year, So, a 2-year tenure, was the exception.
What was the policy as far as the Department of Corrections is concerned? How long would they typically, maximum length, leave somebody in a place like Pontiac?
As long as you could keep it working and keep things going well.
And I assume all the other pictures on the wall were of white men.
Not exclusively, but mostly.
Okay. So you weren't necessarily the first African American on the wall?
I absolutely was not the first African American on the wall. There were 3 African Americans whom I knew during their tenures at Pontiac. So there at least were 3 African Americans who preceded me there.
Okay. What changes did you make to turn things around?
I don't think of radical changes as much as really focusing on doing the things that we were supposed to do, making sure that our policies worked, that people were actually following them, and a rigorous auditing process to make sure that we were self-evaluating. Are we doing this the way that we're supposed to? Are we classifying inmates properly? Is our count procedure, does our count procedure work? Is our movement procedure being followed? And we would do things to set up tests to see if contraband could be smuggled in, if inmates could be out of the cell house that they were supposed to be in and not be missed. And so in some ways, the self-evaluation process was stepped up to really try to keep staff, on their toes and paying attention to what was going on. There were some programs or operations that needed radical change. We had a industries program where they made materials out of sheet metal, and it was a good program in terms of doing the signs that needed to be made out of sheet metal, but disastrous in terms of the amount of and the number of weapons that inmates could fashion out of the scrap metal. And so we put in place a process of where we wanted to eliminate every source of an illegal weapon, of a shank, of metal that shanks could be made out of. I was ambitious enough to want a shank-free environment, because that's how inmates and staff receive their most serious and life-threatening injuries. I can't say that Pontiac really became totally a shank-free environment. But I do believe that the number of inmate-fashioned weapons that were in that environment was substantially decreased through the efforts of staff and looking at our operations and figuring out where is the material that's coming, that this shank that we found, where did that material come from, and how do we cut off the supply of that material?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned just a bit ago about the evaluation of some of the inmates, and I would assume that obviously some are much more violent. Were you able to treat them differently than the general population?
To some extent. Now, do keep in mind that the prison system is very crowded at this time. Pontiac is housing twice as many inmates as they should. There was no super maximum security prison in those days.
We're going to get to that later.
In some days, in order to put someone in segregation where they are under closer supervision, you had to let someone out, and sometimes you'd have to let someone out early. So we didn't have many of the resources that later came to corrections to allow the population to be even better managed. It was a 100-year-old institution with lots and lots of challenges, including crowding.
Mm-hmm. Was gangs a problem for you?
Absolutely. In some ways, a nightmarish problem. When you have people who are bad people in a situation that's crowded, in an older prison where the architectural design works against you, problems like gangs is a huge problem.
Any way you can really work against that, to mediate that?
Of course, you work at it. You try to keep the predators separate from those inmates who might be victimized. You try to do a lot of gang intelligence to figure out who's creating the problems and try to hold them accountable for the problems that they create. You try to separate by moving to different prisons, some of the people who are the most difficult. When I first came to Pontiac, and we really had to get some controls in place and help send a message to the inmates that we were prepared to run the prison, and having staff run it rather than they run it, we actually shift in some bad guys outside of the state of Illinois. Just recognizing that we've got to send a message that we aren't taking anything that you fellas dish out. And so some of the guys who were the most problematic shot callers, as they were referred to, found themselves way off in another land, so as to speak, all with the intent of them getting humane treatment where they were, but far enough away that they weren't able to get people hurt, back at Pontiac or other prisons in Illinois.
What was the racial climate of Pontiac during the time you were there, especially when you first got there?
Well, most of the inmates were African American and Latino Hispanic. That's just the makeup of the maximum security population in Illinois. Most of the staff were Caucasian. The big problems, though, I would not attribute to race. The management issues were dealing with the reality that you have this physical plant that works against you because it was built, a century ago, and you have twice as many inmates that this place is designed to hold, and the inmates are constantly up to no good.
But it wasn't necessarily the prisoner-on-prisoner violence wasn't necessarily racially motivated?
No, it was more gang motivated, if you will, than racially motivated. It was that kind of polarization than it was having much at all to do with race.
Okay. Well, let's move to the real essence of what we were supposed to be talking about all along, and that's your relationship with Governor Edgar, and especially your time in the Edgar administration. What was the first opportunity you had to meet? I would assume Secretary of State Edgar at that time. Was that right?
I never met Secretary of State Edgar.
Okay. So the first opportunity you had to meet him was when?
He was governor, and I was being considered for the position as Director of Corrections. I said earlier, I was not politically involved, so I never was involved with, the campaign activities and those kind of things. He was elected governor, and I got a call on Christmas Eve and asked by a person, why haven't you applied for the position of Director of Corrections? It never occurred to me to apply. I just, was of a mind that the governor looked around to see who could do the job and decided, if he wanted to talk to someone. And so this person asked me to send them my information. I did that day. And then things started to happen, in terms of interviews with the selection committee. There was a committee of people that the governor had appointed as a part of his transition process to interview candidates for various positions. And so I became involved in that process. It did turn out that the mayor of the town of Sheridan, where I lived as warden of that prison, actually did write a letter to the governor, Governor Edgar, asking that I should be considered Director of Corrections, which I found fascinating. And State Senator John Maitland, who later became a congressman, also, wrote a letter in my behalf. No, State Senator Maitland did write a letter, but he wasn't the person who became congressman. The state representative at the time, who later became congressman, also, wrote a letter to the governor in my behalf. And these were men who got to know me as warden because of their concern for the prison and how it was functioning in their district, not from a political perspective. So I sent my information in, and people started talking to me and examining me and looking into my background. And when that vetting process was sufficiently done, I was invited to come to Springfield and meet with Governor Edgar.
Explain that experience. Describe that.
I'm a person who isn't inclined to be in awe or to be nervous or that kind of thing. I remember being very nervous that I was actually, going in to see the governor, and it was a good discussion. Although, or in spite of the fact that I was nervous and apprehensive, it was a conversation that really, I think, characterizes in a lot of ways who Jim Edgar is when it comes to the public administration. He was really wanting to understand my history, my experience, what I brought to the job. He was really trying to figure out, is this a person who is prepared to do this job? Is this a person who is prepared for, who is adequately prepared for? Is he up to this job? There was no discussion of politics and whether I voted for him or how I had voted or any of that. It was really all about corrections, what I thought needed to be done. It was about his reality that we were in a recession and the kind of dollars that, in a sense, had been poured into building new prisons and so forth over the previous 15 years was not likely to be there. And, if I felt I was up to the task of managing within the resources that were available and what my thoughts were about that.
Do you know if he was interviewing other people for the same job?
I do not believe that he actually interviewed other people. No, I do know that he interviewed another person. As I'm recalling now, he interviewed 2 people. Now, there were other people, in addition to the 2 people that he interviewed, who were being considered and who were interviewed by the transition committee and so forth. But to my knowledge, Governor Edgar interviewed 2 people.
Did he make any commitments at the end of your meeting with him?
Commitments in the sense that I was going to have the job?
Yeah.
He did not.
What was your thoughts when you walked out of that meeting?
That I was not going to have the job.
Really? Why do you say that?
I actually didn't think that I put my best foot forward. I was very conscious of, as I said, my nervousness and the intensity of the moment. So I didn't think I had done my best work in that interview.
Well, that being a goal that you'd had for many, many years, well over a decade, kind of a downer walking out of that experience then?
Absolutely. And I guess part of it was the pressure you put on yourself that, this is the moment that you've been waiting for, in a sense. And so it has more importance to me, I think, in an odd way than it had to the governor. He'd have many other opportunities to make key decisions about appointments and so forth, but this was my moment. And I just really didn't think I had done my best work.
When and how did you find out that it was your job to have?
About an hour after the interview, I got a call from the governor's office saying that the governor was indeed going to appoint me to the position and when he was going to make the public announcement.
Well, what was your reaction at that moment?
I was of course excited. I was relieved. This was something that, for almost 20 years I had wanted and worked for, at least the way that I thought you work for something like this. So I was just tremendously excited and had great anticipation of, the contribution I now could make.
Were there discussions between yourself and Governor Edgar, questions like, well, if you got this position, what kind of philosophy would you have? What kind of changes would you want to make? Anything like that in the discussion with the governor?
Absolutely. He wanted to know what kind of manager and leader of corrections I would be. So we did talk about the work, the challenges, and what my thinking was, what my philosophy was, how I felt about capital punishment, how I felt about incarceration, control, security. So, and that's what I meant earlier, that it really was a professional, an interview for a professional position by a professional. He was very focused on what kind of director he would get in me.
What were your initial impressions of the man?
Serious, impressive, thoughtful. I was surprised at how much he actually knew about the goings-on in corrections, how much thought he had given to, if I were appointed, the importance of the first week, or the first month of that, and how that would evolve, I was impressed.
Now, I know you also got a New Year's Eve call. Can you tell us about that call?
The New Year's Eve call was the call about whether or not, or why I hadn't applied for the job. Is that the call you mean?
Well, I thought you mentioned earlier that was a Christmas Eve. That was the New
Oh,
Year's
I'm sorry.
Eve.
That was New Year's Eve that
Okay.
I got the call about why I hadn't applied, and to fax in actually, my information to trigger the process.
Well, and who was it that called you that night?
A woman
that day?
A woman named Janice Cellini.
Who I've interviewed and who has the distinction of being known today as Edgar's patronage chief. I think she was his personnel director, but that's the term that the general public generally knows her. So,
And she was a good one.
and interesting that the patronage chief, who normally you're making the connections between politics and political support and the governor and these plum assignments now that the governor finds himself with. And you already mentioned the subject of politics didn't come up in that discussion at all?
Not at all. I have the sense that for this position and some others, the governor had made it known to his key people, like Janice, that what he was looking for was someone who had standing in the system, someone who, had the right background and experiences to do the job. So her call to me, even though she was the patronage chief, if you will, wasn't a political one. It was, she had become aware of me. It was out of that, remember the heir apparent notion? It was out of that notion that as she started asking people and looking around on behalf of the governor for people who were capable of doing this job, my name came up. And so she called me. And I had not known her prior to that phone call. I consider her to this day a good friend, and she proved to be very, very helpful to me in the course of my tenure in state government. But we didn't come to know each other through the political process.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you a question that you can turn down if you'd like, but I would like to ask you about your own personal political philosophy, if you will.
Do you mean am I a Republican or a Democrat?
No, how would you describe your political philosophy? And I guess that would put you into one camp, I would guess.
I'll say I consider myself a Republican. I consider myself a moderate, which sometimes makes it difficult to be a Republican, depending on the issue. But because of Jim Edgar and the opportunities that he made available to me, I became much more involved in the political process and felt at that time I had much more in common with what might be referred to as a conservative Republican philosophy than a liberal one. Now, interestingly, I grew up, my mother is very political and is a lifelong Democrat and is active politically today at 82 years old. So it was a surprise to her to find that I was a Republican, and maybe even to me when I got serious about thinking about political issues and political questions. So my family consider me much more conservative than I consider myself. If Beverly were sitting here, she would not agree that I was a moderate. She sees me as much more conservative, and on some social issues, that's probably correct.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel that at the time that Edgar was asking you to be his director, you were in sync with his political platform as he was running for governor?
I'll have to confess that I didn't pay much attention to his political platform when he was running for governor. But I felt very much in sync with his philosophy with regard to crime and punishment. You know, the conversation we had, I came away very comfortable that, you know, Jim Edgar was humane. He talked about warning inmates to return to the community better people than they were when they were incarcerated. We talked about treatment, but we also talked about punishment. So I came out of that conversation very comfortable that here is a person who wants the system to be controlled, has no reservations about consequences for bad actions. I came away knowing that in our tenure together, that there was likely to be an execution. I knew that there were several inmates whose appeals were running out, and so we talked about that reality, that there would be an execution during our time together, and whether I was comfortable with that reality.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a sense that he was comfortable with the person who had to decide if the appeals were going to end and finally, I guess, sign a piece of paper condemning somebody to death? Did you have a sense of it at that time?
At the time that we were interviewing, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We knew that we had to trust each other in that process.
Okay.
And we wanted to be comfortable that we were both prepared to do our jobs.
And as much as that's a crime and punishment issue, it's also a political issue, isn't it?
Well, it can be made to be a political issue, but I will tell you that Jim Edgar did not function with it as a political issue. When a person's time came, we staffed the issue with key people around the governor and the governor. And the questions were not, how is this going to look to the public, as much as how convinced we are that capital punishment is right in this case for this person. Mm-hmm. Because he ultimately, in spite of what the courts had done and all of that, he ultimately, had a decision to make as to whether or not the execution would go forward. And I'll remind you that in one instance, while he was governor, a decision was made not to go forward with an execution, but to commute a sentence. And I can say that he did so, and those discussions had full recognition that there is going to be, if he did commute this person's sentence, there would be serious backlash in the media and in the public. And that was not a deterrent for him. He was more focused on what are the issues, what's right. He wanted to know what key people around him thought. Edgar has an interesting decision-making style, and we can talk more about that at some point. Mm-hmm. But he wanted to hear. He would cause a debate on critical issues among key people. He wanted to hear that debate. He asked the tough questions. It would almost at times be like, let's the 3 or 4 or 5 of you all fight about this verbally. And that would help him crystallize his position and to see what the pros and cons were on both sides. But he was decisive, and ultimately he would decide. And no, he did not politicize this decision. I think it would have been unbearable had this just been about the politics of how we're going to look.
Unbearable to you or to him or both?
Fortunately, I think to both. I think that, Edgar is a believer. He has faith of his own. And had a real interest, as conscious as he was of the politics of his position, had an abiding want to do good and to do right.
Mm-hmm. This is a big job you're going into, one that you'd aspire to, as we already have discussed many times, for many, many years. What goals did you have in mind when you walked into the job?
Well, let me first say it was a big job, but I have to say, and I hope this doesn't sound, and it's not taken as egotistical, but I felt very prepared. As I looked back over the various positions I've had in parole services and juvenile corrections and 3 different prisons of different types in different parts of the state and different environments of the state, I really felt prepared. I also felt that there were some people in the Department of Corrections who were up to the task as well. You know, there were people in the department that I had an awful lot of respect for, you know, and some of them were people who were to become deputy directors and other key positions around me as warden of prisons and superintendent of juvenile institutions, and the key staff that I assembled in the director's office. I felt we were up to the task. And the goals were to create in every prison an environment where people could come to work, do their work, and return to their families uninjured. That we would have programs and services that were designed to restore people to their communities, better people. But as I said, an awful lot of it, what keeps governors and directors awake about corrections is safety. People going to be safe. Is it going to be a safe work environment? And trying to help everyone understand that it can't be safe for the employees. It can't be safe for the staff and not safe for the inmates. And so it has to be an environment that's safe for them as well, and that we also owe to their families that these people are sent to prison as punishment, but not to be punished on a daily basis and live a miserable existence. So I wanted a correction system that was respected around the country, that people believe that in Illinois we're doing it right, you know, but recognizing that it's challenging, it's difficult. The year I became director of corrections, as I said, we had the fastest growing system in the country. Jim Edgar came into a situation where there was a recession. We had new prison beds that we didn't have the money to open. So now imagine you've got a very crowded condition. Staff and people are looking for relief, but you've built it, and there's a new prison that's been built down at Wren Lake to become called Big Muddy, but we can't open it because we don't have dollars to do it. We had 3 work camps, as I recalled, and a work release center that had been constructed, but we had not the resources to hire staff and to operate those beds. And so the staff who are aware that, you know, we're going to get this new prison, so our population is going to go down, and we're saying, no, we've got to make this work with what we have right now.
So you understood walking in, and Governor Edgar did as well, apparently, that this growth spurt was going to have to come to an end?
We knew that the prison building every year was going to have to come to an end. We talked about that. You know, the people of Illinois, we thought, couldn't afford to build 15 more prisons over the next 15 years. That had to stop. That didn't mean that there wouldn't be some additional beds And it didn't mean that those beds, almost 2,000 beds that had been built that we couldn't open, that at some point we weren't going to open those beds. But we knew that we needed to look to alternatives to just locking more and more people up for longer periods of time. In the first year that I was director, because we had to squeeze ourselves inside of a budget that was not nearly enough, we eliminated, for all practical purposes, what people would refer to as parole services. There were district offices and regional offices and parole agents with caseloads all across the state, and that went away. We created something called pre-start, where we would actually start while the inmate was still inside of the prison, developing a strategy, developing a plan, so that when they left prison, they would have that plan to operate, and we had far fewer offices for that person to check in with, to get some assistance with the plan and so forth. But we didn't have traditional parole, and saved millions not having traditional parole in the sense that it had existed previously and exists today.
Well, I want to go into that one more, and this might be a little bit awkward, but I think it would be important for you to give us a thumbnail sketch of what Department of Corrections was at the time you stepped into it. And then we can go back to a lot of these initiatives, and we'll start with what was going on in the parole services.
Well, at the time I became director, it had a design capacity. Corrections had a design capacity of about 19,000. It was, in other words, designed to house 19,000 inmates, and we had almost 30,000 inmates.
And that includes youth services?
Yes, that included about 1,300 juveniles. So we were a system that was considerably crowded, and the state's in a recession, and we've got to come up with our share, if you will, of reductions, of savings, because every dollar you spend incarcerating is a dollar you can't spend on education or early childhood services. So we're in a challenged period of time. That was the year two that the legislature went well into July, and the new budget's supposed to happen July 1st. They couldn't agree on a budget July 1st. We went deep into July trying to put together a budget because of the recession and how you balance all of these issues.
What was the male to female ratio like?
Oh, the prison system was mostly male. The female population was growing at a rapid rate. It was growing faster than the male population, but the good news is it was on a much, much smaller base. We had, I believe at the time I became director, 23 prisons, and only one of them at that time was a female prison, and then we had a work release center that was for females. And so most of the rest of it was male. We developed additional female capacity in the coming years, but at the time I came, we basically had one female prison, one female work release center.
You say there was 23 facilities?
Yes.
And they had built 15 of them in the last 15 years?
Yes.
So this is like a tripling of the facilities, if not the prison population. Would the prison population had gone up roughly the same amount?
I don't recall what the rate of growth of the prison population was, but in the 80s there was an explosion of new inmates because of Class X and determinate sentencing, and therefore a corresponding explosion of new prisons.
Mm-hmm. How much of what when you walked into the job, how much of it dealt with the parole services side?
We probably had 20,000, 25,000 releasees at the time I became Director of Corrections. Now, that's not counting those almost 30,000 who are actually incarcerated, but there were another probably 20, 25,000 who are, you know, on the in the community, who have served out, you know, their sentences and are on some period of community supervision or parole, as people traditionally call it.
Mm-hmm. What was the size of the employees? How many employees did the department have?
I don't recall the actual number of employees at the time.
Thousands?
Oh, absolutely. Maybe 16, 17,000.
Okay. Do you have a rough estimate then of the guard versus prisoner ratio that you had in these prisons?
Well, each prison had a different ratio, of course, depending on the size and the configuration, you know, of the prison and the level of security. You know, in a minimum security prison, you're going to have a larger ratio of inmates to staff than you're going to have, for example, in a maximum security or medium security prison. So there wasn't one standard for the entire system. That wouldn't have been very efficient. The ratio had a lot to do with the design of the prison and the type of inmates in that particular prison.
And I assume that most of the prison guards especially were unionized?
No, all of them were unionized.
So you had been a union member yourself for many of these years?
No, I had not been a union member.
Well,
I'd never
give us a
been
little
union
reflection of the relationship between union and management then.
I'm not sure how you mean the relationship between.
Well, were there challenges in that respect?
Oh, absolutely. And I had always been management from the time that unions first became legal in Illinois back in 71 or 72. So I had not been in a union, and in some ways was an antagonist to the union. It was very interesting that when I became Director of Corrections, the president of the union was supportive of my becoming a Director of Corrections when we had had so many tensions over the years between us. But a degree of respect, you know, I understand that unions and union leaders have a job to do, and I have a job to do, and our jobs and our focal of concern may at times conflict. It don't necessarily make either of us bad people. It means that we've got to come to the table and figure out how to make these things work. Well, of course, if you have the kind of crowded conditions that we had, and this new prison that is supposed to open and you're not opening it, that creates a lot of tension with the labor union, because they see that as new union jobs and an opportunity to relieve crowding in existing prisons. All of those parole officers out there were union members, and that you're eliminating parole from their perspective. And so you're eliminating jobs and their members. That always creates a lot of tension and issues that we had to work through.
So when you're talking about eliminating or drastically reducing parole services, that means you're firing a lot of parole officers?
Oh, yes. Many of them.
And what was the public response? That, okay, now we've got these, this is my perception, maybe I'm wrong on this, but now we have all these recently released prisoners out there and nobody's supervising them to make sure that they're entering into the public in a way that's not going to be returning them right back to prison again.
That was one side of the story that others were trying to market and get out. And our side of the story was that providing surveillance, if you will, of parolees was really not a realistic way to manage that population, because it's not that as though you can keep up with 23,000 people or whatever the number is 24 hours a day. And so we were trying to help the public and our own employees see that preparing these fellas for release well in advance of their release date was a more efficient way to provide for public safety, to see to it that they had a resume, they had some job prospects and so forth well in advance of the release date. I think the public, by and large, accepted the strategy. The other thing that we were focused on was, given the nature of the prison system, the crowded nature of the prison system, making sure that we had sufficient number of staff to manage and control that population, and that was a better use of the taxpayers' dollars than all of these parole officers all over the state that returned limited real value. But there was certainly some growing pains and some negative reactions to it. But I can tell you, as I sit here and look retrospectively, that it mostly worked and mostly worked well, and that the number of incidents with releasees during that period of time is not greater than the number of serious releasees today, where they've actually returned to that process, because there was always the human cry among staff who wanted to be parole agents and return to those days, that when the Ryan administration came in, they then hired hundreds of parole agents, and of course they got applauded by people who were the constituents of that. But if you look at how things actually work, if you look at the data, the period of time when we had the pre-start program worked fairly well and was a better return on the taxpayers' investment, I would suggest. And I think it's important to say this is not a statement about the employees who were parole agents. This is a statement about the system and the process and efficiencies.
Well, believe it or not, we've only got a couple minutes left. We've been at this for a while, and it's fascinating to listen to you talk about what it was like during the crucial periods when this explosion is occurring in the Department of Corrections system. And so let me just ask this as the end question for this session, and we'll pick up the rest of the innovations you had to deal with and that you brought into the system as the director. On the parole services side again, and finish with this, was this a decision that was made primarily to save money, or because the inefficiencies of what you saw with the old system?
Well, those two issues belong together. When you're spending taxpayers' money, and when the taxpayer is saying, we have no more money for you, efficiency and performance and results belong together. Even, by the way, in good times, in times of prosperity, state officials, any officials, ought to be really examining, are we returning a value for what we're spending? Are there other ways, better ways, cost-effective ways of doing this? So, yes, the economic times forced upon us a decision, forced choice of, if you want to buy this, you can't buy that. But I would submit it's the right exercise. It was the right exercise for the time. It's the right exercise today.
Very good. Well, I'm afraid we're up to the tyranny of the clock right now, so we'll call this session to a close. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to Mr. Peters, and fascinating insights in the Department of Corrections, and more on in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I might have